Welcome to the Experiencer Group Roundtable. I'm host Jay King, here with Stuart Davis.
Hello, everyone. This is Christmas and my birthday jumbled into one super dense packet of love joy, having JF with us here, who is here from the beginning. He's practically a founder, and I could not be more thrilled.
And Kristen Blackburn.
It is wonderful to see you all, and a huge welcome to you, JF.
J.F. Martel is a writer on art, culture, religion, and philosophy. His essays have appeared in online journals such as Canadian Notes and Queries, Reality Sandwich, The Finch, and Metapsychosis, as well as in print anthologies from Penguin-Tarcher, North Atlantic Books, and Intellect Books. He's the author of Reclaiming Art in the Age of Artifice, published in 2015 by Evolver Editions. His long-form essay, Reality as Analog, Philosophizing with Stranger Things, is available in ebook format from Untimely Books. With Professor Phil Ford of Indiana University, JF co-hosts the Weird Studies podcast, a series of conversations on the intersections of philosophy, the arts, and the weird. JF, it's great to have you here.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Jay, Stuart, Kristen. I'm glad to have this opportunity to reconnect with the Experiencer Group because I was involved in the beginning, and then, life had its way with me, and I'm back now. I'm really happy to be here tonight talking to you.
And in saying that's kind of a tell that you, for those that don't know already, you are an experiencer of anomalous events. In fact, you were on Stuart's Aliens and Artists podcast, talking about that for 3 whole episodes a little while.
Yeah, 3 episodes he gave me. It was very generous of Stuart to put it all online. But yeah, I think I've never been, I've always been open about at least some of those experiences, but that was a real moment for me with Stuart, where I got to really tell the stories and have such a receptive. Stuart is a master listener, and so it was just a wonderful conversation. So when he told me about the Experiencer Group, it just seemed like a perfect idea, just to create a space for people who have had these experiences to be able to meet and discuss and theorize and commiserate or whatever. It just seemed like, it just seemed like a brilliant idea, and it makes me even more courageous, or even less hesitant to talk about my experiences. So yes, I have had. That's the long way of saying, yeah, I am an experiencer.
You had a really great pivotal early experience, sighting that you had along with a school group on a bus in rural Canada. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
So this was in 1989, spring of 1989. I was 12 years old. I was growing up in Ottawa, Canada, which is basically just kind of west of Montreal. And for a school trip, we went all the way to the west coast, to the east coast, to the Maritimes, to spend some time in New Brunswick. And it was on our way back from that trip, and we were between Montreal and Ottawa. And I was looking outside, and we were in the big Greyhound bus sort of thing, and I was just staring out at the early spring landscape out there, just the silhouetted trees and the sky. The sky was overcast. I remember it was just after sundown, and I saw the object I saw this amazingly detailed, intricate flying device of some sort, just below the clouds. We were about 50 kids in that bus, and at least half of us, I remember knowing that at least half the bus was looking out at this thing and talking about it and pointing at it. And there was a little girl behind me. She was crying. She was afraid. And my teacher wouldn't even look at it. He refused to look, despite our efforts to get him to look at this thing as it was just kind of hovering there. And then suddenly it just kind of zoomed off through the clouds and disappeared. And the weird thing for me was that I was, I was a big fan of Unsolved Mysteries at the time, and those Time Life Mysteries of the Unknown books. So I was actually looking for UFOs when I saw it. So I was very incredulous at first because I thought, well, this makes no sense. You don't decide you're going to see one and see one. But then I realized that I always did that when I was when we were going to the cottage, wherever we were going, I was always looking for these things. So yeah, it was an amazing experience.
That's amazing. And I remember that the girl who was crying turned into be the girl that you first kissed, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I
forgot
love
it.
that
I forgot
data point.
about
That is
part,
an
yeah.
incredible data point right there.
Exactly. Yeah.
The
Yeah.
thing that
Yeah.
two things that I absolutely love in hearing this particular sighting, JF, is that it's very close to my heart, because when I was a kid about that age, I was constantly looking for UFOs out the window of any car that I was in or anywhere that I was. It was like I was begging for it to happen, and it never happened. So I love hearing that you were the same way, because I always constantly go through my life thinking, oh, it never happened because I was begging for it to happen. But
Mm,
you kind of were too.
yeah.
And then the other thing you mentioned was your love of unsolved mysteries, which of course I was also eating up with a spoon all the time.
Well, actually, there's another part to this story, or a kind of coda to the story that has to do with unsolved mysteries. And I don't think I mentioned this on Stuart's show, but it just so happened that around this time, it was shortly after I saw this, shortly after the sighting, I was watching Unsolved Mysteries, and they had a segment on I can't remember the name of these papers, and there's a tape too. They were a ufologist had received some documents and also a videotape pertaining to a landing that had taken place in Carp, Ontario. This is a famous case, and I wish I'd prepared for this because I don't remember the name of it and all that. But you can actually find it if you just look at Carp, Ontario sighting, I don't know, 1990 something. So anyways, and it turns out that I think there's kind of consensus now, although I never trust this stuff, but that there was fraud involved, or that there was something inauthentic about the documents. I'm not sure what was going on there, but on Unsolved Mysteries, they showed the tape of this, what was purported to be a saucer, or like a ship that had landed, or I don't want to say ship, an object that had landed and was just sitting there in this field. It was really grainy. Of course, back then it was like some cheap, videotape. And so it was hard to know what you're looking at. But I remember you could see these spinning lights, and there were these flashing lights, I should say. And they were kind of reddish and greenish or bluish. Anyways, I remember thinking that's the thing I saw. Like, that's the thing I saw. And the colors were very similar. The way that the lights were interacting was, and Carp happens to be like just 100 kilometers, not even 50 kilometers away from Ottawa. So I saw a device that then turned up on this tape, purporting to be not a device, but an object that had landed near the spot where I sighted it. So I don't know. It was just very strange.
From then till now, where now you're kind of like professionally weird, you're weird out and about in day-to-day life. What was the process of kind of coming out of the anomalous closet like for you? Were there challenges in navigating instances of kind of personal disclosure between you and people that you knew?
No, it's never been that way for me, because I was always the kid to insist that I knew that such things were possible. I was always very proud of my anomalous beliefs, even before I had experiences. And that experience that I just described on the bus really, for me, just kind of equipped me to deal with skeptics. Like, I'm not saying I know what I saw, but it's certainly, for me, it's certainly kind of convinced me that there was a lot more to this world than we think there is. So I was never ashamed or embarrassed, and I'm not saying this to arrogantly or something. It just so happened that I knew what people thought of me when I said certain things, but I just kind of got off on that. So I had no problem. Later on in my 20s, when I was post-structuralist Marxist, I was still, getting into debates with friends in pubs in Toronto about UFOs and the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot. I'm like, I believe in everything. I just believe it all. So, and I knew that people thought that was just kind of this idiosyncratic or eccentricity on my part, maybe, or something, even though it was real, like I meant it. But it never bothered me, which is why I guess I'm pretty open about saying these things. Now, having said all that, it's, talking about this stuff with friends isn't saying it in public and writing about it. And then, having, work relations, clients you work with find out that you're in. So I still haven't felt the effects of that. I've been doing this thing, and it seems like the people in my life compartmentalize themselves. Like, there are certain people that I work with who don't know I do a podcast, and I'm okay with that. But I'm sure some people would find it strange, But yeah, it's not something that I've ever found difficult to discuss, despite some really intense. There are experiences that I don't like to discuss, or that I don't feel it is appropriate to discuss. But this sighting, for example, and the things I talked about with Stuart, those things are, to me, I just think that people should and must talk about this stuff. This is how it's going to come out and of the closet, and we'll be able to sort this stuff out. So
Totally agree. One thing that strikes me as well is that with the history and with the academic frameworks that you just mentioned, you're also notably possibly one of the weirdest religions for somebody in our scene to possibly be, which is Catholic. You've spoken a bit about the ways in which you felt comfortable your religious faith and your interest in the paranormal can overlap and even complement each other. Would you mind speaking about that a little bit? Because a lot of people have a lot of challenges that way.
Right. No, I get it. And I'm glad you brought it up, because it kind of sets a nice base for a lot of what I'll be saying tonight, because I'm going to be coming at it from someone who has that kind of metaphysical commitment, right? Look, I grew up Catholic as a kid. And the kind of Catholicism that I was raised in was the atmospheric, anomalous feel, like the type of Catholicism that you'll find in places where it's just part of the air you breathe, right? So there was a lot of things. When I was growing up, there were a lot of stories of like, we tell stories about the statues of the Virgin Mary weeping and that sort of thing. Or my grandfather had the story about his friend who decided he was an atheist in the 50s, and he pocketed the host at mass. And when they all met, to smoke some cigarettes outside the church after mass, this guy pulled the host out of his pocket, and then broke it, and supposedly it bled. These were the stories that were told around me. So it was the type of Catholicism that really was kind of open to a lot of stuff that a lot of people out in the culture at large would have been unwilling to entertain as possibilities. So stuff like UFOs and possession and that sort of thing was just, everyone in my family kind of was somewhat open to that stuff. Ghosts, certainly. So I kind of grew up in an environment that was pretty open to it. So that's why I don't see a conflict, because certainly the worldview allows for such things to exist. All right. So, and then but then of course I didn't stay there. I grew up, I went to an arts high school. I was into Buddhism, into philosophy. I went to university, got really into Deleuze and Foucault, and became very, I guess that's agnostic, if not a full-on atheist for several years. And then slowly, as I reached my 30s, I started to realize that some of the questions I had weren't answerable on the worldview that I'd adopted. So I had to do some thinking, and to make a long story short, I ended up returning to that religion. I really can't understand where the conflict would be, because it is one of the few modern religions that still retains a space, keeps a space open for the anomalous, for the strange. I guess the problem is that it also imposes a filter upon you where you're supposed to categorize, to file the phenomena in very neat categories as they occur. And I don't believe that's an epistemological tool that's very useful. So I see my religion as, let's say, one aspect of, or how can I say this? I see it as a harbor in a very strange world. Let's just look at it that, and let's just leave it at that. And it's a world that I don't pretend that my particular religion has explained away. So I think that it's a pluralistic form of Catholicism that allows for other ways of being and modes of seeing.
I can deeply appreciate that.
Yeah.
Stuart?
So JF, as always, my obsessive love for weird studies included the most recent episode and the discussion around probes. And so to begin with, I was wondering if you might say a bit about probes and rifts as part of the grammar of the anomalous. And I find myself really fascinated around the detail of it being intended to change the percipient's mode of thought or feeling or contemplation more so than a particular version of it. So the reason I felt drawn to this in the context of the experiencer group, and you're coming to speak with us here today, is that listening to that podcast and considering probes and then tracking the genealogy of my own anomalous life, I felt really resonant with the possibility that the intelligence behind these events and contact points perhaps introduced these elements, you might consider them probes or rifts, to not produce a particular interpretation from me, but to change my interpretive apparatus, if that makes sense. And so the question I have for you is, like, in the population of experiencers in your life, perhaps first and foremost, do you think there's an intention around the way these are introduced into experiencers' life? And what can be said about that third rail of, no, it's not whether it's real or unreal, it's actually this third whole other category, perhaps it's attempting to invite us into. Does that make sense as a question? Can you riff on that for a while? No pun intended.
It makes a lot of sense, and it's a big question. Okay, so you just, for your listeners or viewers, like the rift and the probe. So the idea of probes comes from the work of Marshall McLuhan, who a good example, the simplest example, is his famous quip, the medium is the message. So this Marshall McLuhan was really good at coming up with, really sharp, enigmatic, aphoristic statements that he would put out there. And it wasn't so much in the spirit of being right or of summing up some kind of syllogistic formula in this, kind of proverbial form. It was more like he was trying to probe reality, coming up with ideas that weren't so much about identifying or developing propositions that correspond to phenomena out there, so much as just coming up with powerful symbolic formulations that could be interpreted in different ways and open up new ways of thinking. So that's what McLuhan was really good at. So, like when he came up with the idea of the global village, or when his ideas about how media are extensions of our sensory apparatus. So a lot of these things, of course, he developed in his work, but he always had a way of kind of summing it up in a little phrase that could just be taken out of its context and work as a kind of tool for analyzing and for searching. The idea of the rift is something that we linked the idea of probes to the idea of rifts on the show we just released. And the rift is from my book, Reclaiming Art in the Age of Artifice. And what I kind of theorize in there is that in a work of art, in a great work of art, you'll always find one, two, or more elements that don't fit, that call attention to themselves, that stand out, that either indicate a kind of gap in logic or some kind of lacuna, something's missing. Often in the film, it'll be like a continuity error, quote unquote, or in a painting, it'll be just a slight misalignment of body parts on a figure, for example. That could be one way of doing it. And in the book, my idea was that these rifts, which sometimes seem like errors or flourishes or exaggerations on the part of the artist, are actually really central. If you focus on the rift, the whole work takes on a different light and starts to be, it starts to open up to new interpretations. So I think that the probe and the rift are very different. The rift is when you're looking at an aesthetic object and you notice something's missing or something's off, but that's something off. When you turn it into a positive tool for interpreting the work, becomes a kind of probe in McLuhan's sense. So in either case, you have this idea of discontinuities, of error, of cracks in things, right? It's the idea that the truth is, you're going to find it not in the smooth, outpouring of logical propositions following one another, but the truth will come in the hiccup between two propositions, or in the moment of stuttering where the speaker can't find the next word. That's kind of where the real kind of asserts itself. Synchronicities are a great example of this, right? You go for a walk and you see you'll see clouds coming by, and all of a sudden this one cloud, there's just something weird about it. It spells your name, or it looks like the face of your grandfather or something like that. Or Jung's famous story of the golden beetle, right? He's a patient of his is describing a dream of a scarab, and at that precise moment a kind of shiny beetle lands on the windowsill, and then Jung takes it and gives it to the patient, says, "Here's your scarab." Synchronicities are rifts in life. They're moments that they make no sense. They make no sense because they're, as Jung said, acausal. It'd be absurd. You'd have to be really you'd have to go into really weird mind space to come up with the causal chains that would have to conspire to make this event happen. In a way, it happens despite causality, not because of it. So if you link the idea of rifts, probes, synchronicities, again, you have this idea of discontinuities, of something breaking in, of something it's almost like the matrix glitching a little bit. And I think phenomenologically speaking, these moments do change our perceptive apparatus, right? The world just seems like a neat, tidy, deterministic causal system, just like Newton would have wanted it most of the time. But then in a moment of synchronicity, all of a sudden the work looks like a strange intended work of art. And so our perception goes from the physical or the causal, let's say, or the discursive, into the aesthetic, the theophanic, and the poetic all of a sudden, right? Could it be that this all, and so I think that those events have that effect on us, and they call attention to the, for lack of a better term, the kind of poetic or aesthetic nature of reality. And so when it comes, though, to talking about the intention behind this particular synchronicity or that particular experience, encounter, I tend to be really, really kind of pluralistic about that stuff, in the sense that I never feel satisfied. I never feel satisfied with theories of a kind of unitary intelligence behind it all that's trying to communicate, but rather with a kind of seething horde of intelligences and entities out there that may or may not have agendas that involve us. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But there's a lot going on. And I also want to distinguish encounters of the types, and I can only go on what I've lived and what I've read, encounters with specific entities and mystical moments where I feel like I'm being I'm becoming attuned with a level of reality that is even beyond those entities, something more mystical or maybe something more theological, which to me feels completely different from the kind of weirdness that I've experienced when in the vicinity of, let's say, demonic entities. So there's just like, I'm all about the distinctions, and I guess it's really like it depends on what case we're discussing. Yeah, I hope that's satisfactory as an answer. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's amazing and beautiful. And it calls to mind when you mentioned the poetic nature of reality, rift, and our various attempts to gain greater acquaintance with what we might call the lexicon or the grammar of the anomalous, and then providing for this great multitude, this multiplicity of kinds of beings and ways they contact us and when they do or do not have desired outcomes. And you guys were speaking a bit about Esperanto, and that calls to mind constructed languages. This has been an area of great interest for me. I constructed a language to try to self-induce a rift to cause my engagement with reality to shift as it expressed through language. And the success or failure of it, again, really not being the point, more just like, is this something we can do? Can we examine the filters we inherit in our linguistic systems and improve them and change the way we relate to the real to deepen it? What's your take on all of the, just broadly, light languages, constructed languages? This is a big subculture within the experiencer world. And you'll have a whole population of folks saying, I channeled this language came through still and pure from these beings as a way to form a bridge between. Others have a more artistic or aesthetic anchor point with it. What's your acquaintance with that part of experiencer world, and what's your take on that linguistic subculture?
Right. Well, I mean, we're right into the medium is the message thing here for sure, because when you're creating a language, I think the greatest poetic act is probably the creation of a language. My personal favorite, I know this is kind of maybe a little typical, but is Tolkien's creation of the Elvish language, which I think is a phenomenal achievement because it's so coherent, cohesive, and stands on its own, such that from what I understood anyways, Tolkien was first and foremost interested in developing a language, inventing a language so that he might know the world he was creating. So he wasn't like world building is like, oh, I'm going to like Roddenberry, like I'm going to design a Klingon language for this world because I want these Klingons and I want them to have their own language. No, it was like the language, he was creating the language and the world was flowing out of it, because a language is a world. A language is the, let's call it the semiotic correlate of a world. So when you're creating a language, you're creating a new medium and you're creating a new message, new content in a certain way. Or I don't like the word content. It's creating a new mode of seeing that once you've kind of donned it and are using it, is indistinguishable from having created another world or experiencing the world in such a new way that it might as well be a new one. So I'm not familiar with the artificial language scene or the created language scene, because I did a little bit of research on that years ago, so I can't really speak to it. But certainly I think that when you're like, it's one thing to use a code, it's another thing to create a cipher, to create a code, because then you're making you're creating new possibilities. And so it seems like the ideal way to try to engage with the universe in a poetic way seems to be to, that's the first thing that God told Adam to do, is like name things. And he started naming things, and humans are the only creatures, let's say that we can measure, because there are other creatures as well, but that name things. We name, and in naming, we call something out of them. We don't create them by naming them, but we draw out some aspect of their being such that it stands out. I sound like Heidegger, but stands out in a space where it can exist. And I think that's a really powerful act. But I hope. Anyways, I'll leave it at that. You'll have to edit out my kind of like self-deprecating. Oh, I hope that's okay. Things at the end of my answers. I
Or
don't know, I'm doing that
duplicate it.
tonight.
Turn it into a chorus.
Exactly. Just collect them all, and put them all at the end.
I'll hand the baton to Kirsten.
Thank you, Stuart. And actually, I kind of want to loop back a little bit to this idea of the rift, because I was calling back to my experience as a theater student back in the 80s, and how we were taught very firmly that when you write a play or a film or something like that, you must come up with a world in which everything within that narrative fits with the rules of that world. And that if you don't create a good world, you basically don't have an airtight story. And story, of course, is everything, right? And we know that film these days and TV shows, they don't always adhere to that rule. But it's fascinating to me to think about that incongruous part of a piece of art that makes you not be able to look away. And it goes counter to this idea of creating a world in storytelling.
Yeah, it goes counter in a way, but it, in a sense, it's kind of the one. It's like, to get a full pack of cards, you need the Joker, even though you leave the Jokers out every time you use the cards. They still put the Joker in the box because you need the Joker in there. So in a sense, like the rift is just, it's just that, there's a kind of a cliche trope from cartoons and stuff where the painter finishes the painting and then at the end looks at it, it's like, no, and then just like throw some paint on it or just put some kind of smear on it and like, there, it's done.
Masterpiece.
It's the idea that there's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in, the kind of Leonard Cohen thing. And often it'll come in despite your best efforts to keep it out. I'm trying to think of an example. An example will come to me as we speak, as we continue to talk, but often, there are kind of two basic modes of artistic creation, right? Susan Sontag wrote about this. Friedrich Nietzsche kind of came up with the Apollonian mode and the Dionysian mode of creating. And so you'll have a poet like Rimbaud, who's a Dionysian poet. He just doesn't even think of what he's doing. He just writes these poems. He does it all within about 3 years, and then he just never writes again. That's kind of like you burn hard and bright, and then you go out. And then there's the other type of artist who painstakingly, Robert Frost, works at something over decades, right? And then finally achieves their peak in middle age. And every poem is very much, constructed line by line, word by word. And I think that in the end, though, you'll find rifts in both types. The Dionysian work might be filled with rifts because it's not depending so much on the kind of internal cohesiveness of a self-contained world, whereas the Apollonian work seems to all kind of fit together. But nevertheless, in all instances that I was able to study when I was writing the book, and ever since then, because I've continued to work on this, you can always find something that subverts or contradicts the logic of the world. And I've found that when you pay attention to this thing, the world becomes even more alive. So it's very strange, but it seems to be a structural component of any type of functional system, is that it'll have what Deleuze calls a line of flight, something that's shooting out of it. And that just seems to be necessary to have a world or a system that actually does something, that actually works.
Well, and
Yeah.
it's really interesting because, as you probably know, a lot of the members here on the Experiencer group are amazing artists. It
Right.
seems like experiencers and artists go hand in hand, because when someone has an anomalous experience, of course, it changes their perception and it opens them up, and they very often are very hungry to portray it somehow on paper or communicate it somehow. But that in itself, the experience itself, is usually a break in the rules of our world.
Yeah.
Big time, big
Of
time,
course. Yeah.
and
Exactly.
surprising.
Yeah. Yeah. And it requires a kind of poetic response. Whether you actually go and write a poem about it or make a painting, no, it might be just a change in lifestyle or a change in outlook, but there's something about the arts that give us a way to express and communicate these experiences in a way that, normal discursive language wouldn't allow you to do. So Jung was very aware of this. Carl Jung, when he worked people through the individuation process, and in that process, there are times when there are anomalous experiences, including like poltergeist-like phenomena might start happening around your house. You might start seeing strange beings in your environment. You might, of course, the dreams and the visions and all that. And during that time, Jung would make it, he would insist that the analysand, or the patient, the person undergoing individuation, express this experience either through imagery or music or creating mandalas. There's all kinds of techniques that he would develop, but the important thing is to express it, to give it material form, right? Even a dance is giving material form to an idea. That's what art is. It's making more matter. You're creating more matter. You're doing something new with matter in art, even if the matter is just the sound waves. So it seems like the phenomenon, whatever it is very closely tied to the artistic experience, to creativity.
And before I hand this over to Jay, I just wanted to say that your concept of what did you call it? A seething, I don't know how you exactly
Seething
said,
horde?
a seething horde of entities. I just love that, because I love it's so easy for us as humans to try to nail down, like, what's the one intention, what's the four intentions of the four different entities. Well, it's probably thousands and thousands of different intentions.
Yeah, it probably is. But what you often encounter is a tendency to want to reduce it to one. And I don't know if that's a function of what certain entities would want certain experiences to believe. I'm sure a lot of entities would like to be the one and only entity, and so will give you that kind of impression. Or sometimes, if it's just that you're actually in touch with something much deeper than any particular entity, you're more in touch with the background of all entities. This is what I think. This is what I call God, is the background of all the entities. So, and that can happen too, in which case we can adopt a unitary approach if we're talking about the background. But as a Catholic, I have to say that even that, it'll have to be a trinity. Even there, you'll need a multiplicity. So it's like there's no oneness to find that you can really hang on and trust. I personally feel that when you encounter something that asserts itself as a oneness, I feel like I need to be wary. That doesn't mean I think I'm right to feel that way, but that's my feeling. I have a kind of visceral reaction to oneness.
It's tricky, right? And you speak often about the trickster in some of your podcasts, and the work of people like George P. Hansen and things like that. And I agree in terms of like the wariness that needs to be there when encountering something that's portraying itself as a solitary or absolute or the one situation. And at the same time, of course, there's people, anybody might have that experience. They go up on the mountain, they have that experience, and then there's either because of culture or personal psychology, whatever, there's there's the temptation to kind of want to bring a tablet back down the mountain with you, right? And then we realize over the years that, gosh, there's a lot of tablets. There's just tons of tablets around here. What do we do with all these tablets? Along those lines, you're talking about, the utilitarian nature of art in terms of processing and things like that. And I deeply appreciate that, because that in itself is like a beautiful, wonderful perversion of the way that art is often portrayed. And I think that I deeply appreciated that about your thought a lot. And in many ways, you're very well read on the subject of the paranormal and the deeply weird. And you're immersed in an online world, as many of us are, that's often quite interested in the anomalous, the weird, the phenomena, with quotation marks around it. Who do you wish, when you look around at the culture at large, or just the general conversation that's happening these days, any version of that, who do you wish more people would read? Whose ideas do you think are well suited or are particularly utilitarian for our time, and why?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, Patrick Harper is probably one of my favorite writers on this topic, because he combines a kind of very open, pluralistic, I wouldn't call it skeptic, but skeptic in the right sense approach, combines that with a kind of Neoplatonic grounding that I actually find quite surprisingly freeing and refreshing. So Patrick Harper's book, Daimonic Reality, is one of my favorite books. So I would certainly, if someone were trying to get into this stuff, I would say you have to read Patrick Harper's Daimonic Reality, specifically that book. I'm just looking at my shelf here. Well, Eric Davis, of course, his book, what is it called? High Strangeness? High Weirdness. I always forget which one it is a fantastic and intellectually rigorous kind of study of the phenomenon or the phenomena as they manifested in like 70s culture, which was really the kind of explosive moment where a lot of this stuff became both, it asserted itself most strongly and powerfully at that moment. At least it was a wave, it was a flap, as we call it, but also it was showing its dark side too. And I think that one of the things that people need to, that we know this, it's that it's not a game, right? There's something actually real going on there, and we don't quite understand it, and one must tread with care. Another book that I would recommend people read is Colin Wilson's The Occult, not because it's a source of authoritative knowledge on matters of the occult. It's a very idiosyncratic and strange book that Colin Wilson wrote, but he was a kind of genius, and he had a way of just riffing, probing like McLuhan a little bit, and coming up with all kinds of really novel interpretations and making really interesting connections. And I found that reading his book, The Occult, was actually not just a really entertaining experience, but a really kind of enriching and informing, kind of informative experience that I'd recommend. So I guess those are writers that I would recommend. Of course, now you've asked me this, I'm sure there are many more that I could have mentioned, but those are the ones that came to mind right now.
That's a great start. I deeply appreciate that. And yeah, we covered high weirdness in our book club on the Experiencer Group site, and boy did I love that book, and I know some others in this room did as well. It is a really fun read. I mean, Eric Davis has such great turns of phrase, and
he's a great writer.
His headspace and his version of what the 70s were that's kind of like, if I had a time machine, I would go back to Eric Davis's version of the 1970s. Maybe more so than the version that actually existed for like, my parents.
I agree. He's kind of like P.T. Anderson, like not just a man, but a setting. So like Eric Davis is a place, not just a guy. It's an impressive achievement to be a place.
That's awesome.
I think like Neil Gaiman and the Sandman made G.K. Chesterton a place, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyways, so I want to be a place one day, like Eric.
Oh my gosh, I'm writing that down. Thanks. I think along the lines of places and times that we kind of romanticize, maybe people sometimes think that we're in kind of a paranormal heyday right now, with UFOs on the cover of the New York Times and being discussed in Congress, the wide range of weird online content, and say weird studies even being funded by people like Robert Bigelow out there. I've heard you kind of wistfully speak about other eras, for example, the spiritualist movement, other eras. Do you think there's ever been a better time than right now for the paranormal?
I'm a proponent of the David Lynch theory of modernity, which is that something happened in New Mexico in 1945 that changed something, that made some fundamental alterations in the fabric of things. So I'm referring, of course, to the detonation of the atom bomb in New Mexico, and then, of course, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I you know, in the scene, we often hear things like that's when the UFOs started coming. That's when the contact was became more urgent between civilizations or species, or however you want to term it. I think something happened then, and it's been building ever since. So I think that it's been an increasingly good time to be weird every day since August 6, 1945. Good being good in the sense that, like, I don't know, The Shining is a good movie. Not necessarily good as in like this all is going to end well and this is a swell time we're having. I do think that, of course, there were other times in history where I think the veil was very thin indeed between worlds, and contact and experiences, and the way we're using the term here, were much more common. And in fact, that I think people were better equipped to deal with a lot of these things because of established traditions of esoteric practice or mystical practice or whatever, that enabled people to develop, let's say, a language to deal with this stuff. I think that today there are probably more people than ever who meet the criterion of what would have constituted a mystic in other ages. So we have a world with lots of mystics and very few traditions left to guide them, such that we are left doing things like inventing our own languages to deal with this stuff. And I think that has amazing affordances and incredible dangers. So I think it's probably the most dangerous time to be into this stuff. It's also the time, I think, where this sort of phenomenon is being the most assertive it's ever been, in a way, maybe. And so that, I guess, that all adds up to a really good time to be talking about weird stuff, because we don't have a choice anymore. We need to talk about it. But also, I can't shake the feeling of danger, both for me personally when I'm in dealing with the sort of thing, and also just collectively. I just feel like we're headed for something we don't quite understand. That's my honest answer.
I think that's honest and very perceptive, and I appreciate what you're portraying there, almost in terms of kind of a DIY mystery school aspect to what we're kind of left to deal with these days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's what Crowley wanted, so he got his wish. Every man and woman is a star shining in the darkness.
Changing it up a little bit here, because I want to talk about Utopia, and you seem like a perfect person to discuss Utopia with, because you're so well read, and also because you often talk about Finite and Infinite Games, which was written by James Carse, Dr. James Carse. He was actually one of my sweetheart's professors at NYU in
Oh,
the 80s.
wow.
Yeah, he took, I think, 4 courses with him while he was at NYU. And one of them was called Utopian Societies. And I guess through the course, whether it was a semester or a quarter or something like that, he would bring up books like The Island, various different philosophies of utopia and things like that. And basically, he would take, he would ask the whole class to weigh in on what about this utopian community is working, what doesn't work. And at the end of the course, long story short, he discovered that, or revealed to the students, that the one utopian community they all agreed on that could possibly work was fascism. And it was, this is something that I talk about with Kurt, my sweetheart, all the time, that, how is it possible to create something that works? And very often I was listening to your podcast about, it was called Curing the Human Condition on Wild Wild Country, which was a series about Bhagwan Rajneesh, which I actually knew people in that group back in the day. And it made me think about this even further, because it seems like every utopia, every spiritual community starts out with the very, very best intentions. And people are sincerely happy and sincerely loving each other, but then something goes terribly wrong. And do you have any idea what that thing is that happens?
Yeah. I mean, okay. I can't believe you had James Carse as a professor. It's one of my favorite books, so I'm very.
It wasn't me; it was my husband. But yes.
Okay.
He did.
Yeah. That's fantastic. Yeah, well, I think that he would probably say the problem with utopias is they are inevitably going to be a finite game, because you're trying to contain things. I'm trying to find the right angle into this question, because I think it goes back to the rift. The rift is if it's a necessity that any coherent structure will contain some chaotic element, some hint of chaos, then it means that even the most perfectly designed social, let's say, organization will contain some kind of wild free radical that's going to come in there, and it's going to turn things into their opposite. The Greek name for that process by which things turn into their opposites is enantiodromia, which means like something pushed to its extreme will just turn into its opposite. So I'm going to try to say this very simply. In my assessment, the problem with any type of intentional community is that it chooses one intention. Societies that work and thrive have many competing intentions, right? So let's say the intention is, I don't know, the protection of the environment, living sustainably. Well, the one intention becomes the an overarching ideal that is supposed to color everyone's life, everyone who chooses to be part of the community, everybody's life, and also every moment of their lives. So they get up in the morning and they're in a community now that's about sustainability. So they're having breakfast, and the breakfast has to be about sustainability, and they're get mad at their kids, and getting mad at their kids has to be done in the spirit of sustainability. It's like the one intention inevitably means all kinds of things that have nothing to do with sustainability in the day-to-day, because we're all many people, we're different as parents than we are as friends, and I find that the intentional communities tend to try to contain a kind of seething horde of priorities and forces. Even each of us is many, many different things, and to contain them in some kind of necessarily rational ideal that, in being a rational concept, already contains its own opposite. You can't say love without hate, and the love will, it occasions the shadow of the ideal follows you into the community. So I'm talking about now like small scale intentional communities, and why I think they often fail. The ones that succeed are the ones that allow for a kind of paradox of, or kind of a paradoxical balance of ideals. And you'll see that, for example, among the Mennonites or the Amish, where although they have a very rigid society, it functions because of internal dynamics within their interpretation of scripture, which to them is what everything is based on, that allow them to balance out, to offload elements that don't work, or like, ostracize the right people, bring the right people in, and kind of maintain the ballasts, through time. And it actually works. It works surprisingly well when you consider that many of these communities remain essentially kind of like horse and buggy level to this day, at least on Sundays. So when we talk about large scale utopias, well, we're actually in the middle right now of an attempt to bring one into being. Elon Musk, Bill Gates, all these tech lords they have a very kind of cohesive and shared ideal of what the perfect world would be like. It's a world where everyone is in the system, where things happen smoothly digitally, and where basically the levers of society are immediately accessible in a completely transparent space of control. And that's where we're headed. It's the first time that we are trying to create a planetary control system designed to provide a kind of utopian experience. And the chances that it'll fail, if you have even a modestly realistic outlook, are 100%. So it's not going to work. It's going to fail, and it's going to fail on a planetary scale. So I think that now more than ever, we need a kind of realism. And I don't mean a realism like a political, like a realistic realism. I mean a realism of embracing the fact and accepting the fact that reality exceeds our conceptual powers, such that any type of conceptualization we come up with, no matter how adequate to a particular situation, will inevitably and necessarily fail to explain or to contain the situation on the horizon, the next situation, or what's around the bend. And we need to be able to develop a kind of metaphysical outlook, let's say, of the world that can tolerate a sufficient amount of paradox to be able to deal with the reality that exceeds our conceptual powers. And that, to me, is what a lot of the traditional societies were able to do, and that modern society seems intent on not being able to do, because it's so much geared towards rationalism and a kind of exhaustive rationalism that tries to contain the entire picture. So.
Well, and also it seems like our society now is addicted to panacea, which, panacea sells. So if there's something that solves multiple problems, it's going to sell. And people, I feel like we're a little bit addicted to that. So we look towards one answer to solve multiple problems, and we lock ourselves in sort of a golden cage by doing that. And by listening to very few people, which goes back to this, idea of if there's one voice coming through that is saying, I have the answers to everything, I have the panacea. This is something that, I'm sort of paraphrasing you, but this is something I don't trust. And it sounds like something you don't trust.
Right. Well, the doctrine of original sin forbids me from trusting anyone who says something like that. First and foremost, myself. But if you want to take a little bit of the kind of scarlet letter tinge off the idea of original sin and look at it as purely as an epistemic doctrine about the limitations of human knowledge and how we never see the full picture and we're always missing something. And all of our judgments are partial because we can never get the view from nowhere that would afford us an absolute final judgment. If that's your interpretation of what original sin means, then everyone is quote unquote guilty of it. Everyone is partial. Nobody has final authority. And so that to me is the best argument for being a progressive that I can find, is that I can't trust anybody to lead me to the promised land. So and including myself. So it's only through community, through discussion, through dialogue, through exploration, through you know, comparing and debating. This is how we progress as a polity, and that's how, and whatever it is that we want to inhabit in the future, whatever kind of society we wish to build, hopefully will be one that's founded on the type of pluralistic values that will enable us to navigate a very complicated and chaotic universe. You know,
I just briefly want to affirm that sentiment, and I also feel its connection to how I see some of our core values here at the Experiencer Group, which is that we're not a solution factory, that all variety of questioning and support can coexist in concert. And yeah, there's dissonance in there. That's part of how beautiful music gets made. But I think I really appreciate and have been trying to live and have enjoyed us attempting to live that multiplicity and pluralism here in the Experiencer Group with some humdingers of puzzles, right? Like there's really some doozies here in our midst. So I feel optimistic about that. I think in the broader sense, maybe in the real long term. But the question I have for you about that teeming great sound, which is our cosmos, is around something you had been discussing recently. You and Phil were exploring how the human being is constantly from inception permeated and permeable with sound, and that this is distinct among our senses because we can plug our nose, we can close our eyes, shut our mouth or whatever, but you can't even plug in your ears. You're suffused with and functioning as a sounding in infinite sound. I find that really interesting. And I have a two-parter around that. Number one, do you feel that that is the case after excarnation or in between lives, after death, in these other realms in which the constituent ecosystem might be utterly metaphysical or whatever? So could you give us a brief tour of some other realms and how that may or may not hold true there? And then also I was just curious around your take on anechoic chambers, these environments constructed to acoustically perfectly, or as perfectly as possible, insulate a human being to experience a sound-free environment. And that has been shown to be really problematic for a human being. That if you stay in an anechoic chamber, you'll die, basically. Like you just, so I thought of that as kind of this prosthetic human attempt to engineer an earlid. And why is that verboten when none of the others are? Those are the questions. I know it's a bundle, but.
Fantastic. Well, the first thing I want to say is about the Experiencer Group is that one of the really important decisions you made, kind of threshold decision, was to not to limit it to a particular type of experience, not to say this is about people who've encountered grays or this is about people who've encountered mantises, and not because there'd be a problem with that, but what you've created is a space that has that polyphonic quality that will allow kind of new discoveries to be made as a transphenomenal kind of dialogues take place that might combine things from different places. And we all know that people like John Keel were, what made them great was that they were able to connect like Bigfoot stuff to UFO stuff where nobody was doing that before. So that's a kind of simplistic way of putting it. So you want your communities polyphonic. That's the first thing, and diverse in every sense. About the so sound, and this is really interesting that you ask this question, Stuart, because it's something that I've been thinking a lot about these days, and I'm doing a course right now on G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy. So it's basically a course on weird Catholicism. But one of the dichotomies that have come in useful in this course is the dichotomy of the digital and the analog. And I first explored that for myself in an essay called Reality is Analog, which I wrote about the first season of Stranger Things when it came out in 2016, 17, I can't remember. And it occurred to me that, well, I'm not going to talk about Stranger Things. I'm just going to talk about basically conceptually what this means, the digital and the analog. Well, we all know what analog technologies are. They're technologies of we all know what digital is. Digital is technologies that depend upon a translation of content into kind of a binary language, and then there's an output back into another. So, for example, a digital camera takes a picture, and there's kind of a matrix in the camera where there's just these pixels, and the pixels interpret light and then create a new image that represents whatever it is you were photographing. Whereas an analog camera has a film, and when the light, you open the chamber, the light hits the emulsion of the film, and then these crystals explode and form an image that resembles the object you were photographing. But essentially, in an analog technology, you have complete continuity, right? There's a flux and a continual kind of exchange of forces that results in whatever it is you're trying to create. So there's no qualitative difference between taking a picture with an analog Kodak camera and looking into a mirror. It's the same type of physical interactions going on there. Whereas with the digital, there's always a translation, right? The light stops inside the digital camera, and then the digital camera creates a new image. So the digital has to do with discrete units, ones and zeros, leaps across intervals, the absence of intervals. It means like white then black. There's no gray, right? That's kind of the digital way of thinking. And the analog is more a flux kind of Heraclitean kind of idea of flows, of things flowing into one another. Well, sound is very analog and sight is very digital. At least when pushed, sight is digital when it's pushed to its extreme. So sight, and McLuhan's whole critique of visual culture was that it's turning us into, what do you call them? Well, essentially, I'm going to put words in his mouth. It turned us into digital creatures. The eye is always looking at one thing at a time. So it's looking at that and then at this, and you kind of skip over the interval between A and B when you're looking from A to B. You kind of just see A and then B. So you're living in a world, the visual world's almost cinematic. It's cutting from one thing to another constantly in a kind of digital way. Sound, however, we're just always immersed in it. You can't close your ears like you can close your eyes. You can mentally focus on part of a sonic landscape, but you can't just home in on one particular element. You're always going to hear everything else. McLuhan was big on how literary culture, so the development of alphabets and letters and written languages, moved us from an acoustic space, an acoustic universe, into a visual universe. And that made us more perspectival, unidirectional. It developed the Western idea of conquest and, like the idea of science and optics, and that kind of like, it increases or it emphasizes the subject-object relationship and makes the subject and the object very separate from one another. That's what the eye has done to us. And McLuhan thought that now we're moving back into a kind of an acoustic space. But the point is this: the universe is analog, of course. So even if you make music with a digital synthesizer and mix it with your digital, plugins on your computer and output it on a CD or as an MP3, well, your ears are analog. So the minute the music comes back to you, it's an analog phenomenon once more. And I think that the idea of the anechoic, is that how you say it? Anechoic? Yeah, the anechoic chamber is that it blocks out, it creates a completely digital physical space. And so whenever you watch movies, whenever they want to put you in a totally abstract digital space in a movie, the soundtrack becomes blank, mute. In The Matrix, when he first appears against that white background with Morpheus, he wakes up and there's no sound at all. There's no hum, nothing. It's just total silence. That's what digital space is like. And the reason it has a negative effect on human beings, these anechoic chambers, when people go in them, is because we don't live in an analog universe. And those chambers are the closest we've come to creating an actual digital environment in the real world. And because the world we actually live in is a world of interconnected flows and things flowing in and phasing into one another. It's a confusing, chaotic world. It's because the world is analog that utopias can't work. But we want to make the world digital. This is a human thing because a digital world is knowable. And so these chambers are extremely enticing because they block out the things we can't control. If they're like the ultimate, it's like every laboratory tries to basically eliminate as many variables, as much of the universe as it can, in order to create a completely neutral space where an experiment can unfold. Well, these chambers are a perfect example of that. They're blocking out the one thing that no one can ever block out, which is sound. And in doing that, they create a kind of nightmarish digital space where humans can't exist in that space for very long. So I think that if nothing else, these anechoic chambers can serve as a kind of warning about our tendency and our desire to digitalize everything, and to basically, if we're going to follow Zuckerberg, basically all move into the metaverse, right? That's kind of the goal. And so we can maybe look at the effects of, what human beings experience when they go into these spaces as a kind of parable or warning about what will happen when we finally made our entire world digital, which seems to be our goal sometimes.
That is so fascinating and such a satisfying take on that little perplexing riddle. And I would just throw my hat in the ring for that to be a future episode of Weird Studies or Aliens and Artists when you come back on.
Sure. It'll be even better when I get to think about it for more than 2 seconds. It's the McLuhan is someone I've been thinking a lot about because Phil and I have been discussing him a lot recently. And I just think that some of those insights are just, we're still kind of we're still discovering, we're still learning how relevant and how prophetic this man was in his work. And I think that that's maybe one piece of it right there. But
I've been reading some of these essays that Robert Bigelow, this somewhat eccentric billionaire, recently funded a contest. Folks were asked to write essays on the best evidence that they could find for the survival of consciousness after physical death, right? And they're fascinating essays. They're all up online for free. And some would suggest that we may exist in some kind of bizarre pocket, because some of these essays, they're trying to find a lay of the land, right? Lay of the land of consciousness, the idea of where are we and where are we not, right? So we kind of have to come up maybe with some kind of a mental map of where we are or where we're not, or where we would transcend to, right? So there's this idea that we may exist in some kind of bizarre pocket, right, that observes things like time and embodiment within some larger and more fundamental realm, liberated of constraints like time, and that maybe there are even intermediary layers, like perhaps ones addressing an afterlife. And as a Catholic who's deeply researched concepts like mediumship, ghosts, poltergeist, channeling, reincarnation, etc., what do you make of the afterlife? And do you have a personal kind of mental map of unseen realms that you prefer these days?
Yeah, that's a great question. Super fun. This is a lot of fun. These are great questions. Not because I think I know the answer, but because nobody has the answer. So my sense has always been this. I think that when we die, it's the most typical cliche thing that happens. Like, basically, I think, Ghost with Patrick Swayze pretty much nails exactly what it's like to die and not go to some other side. I think that there are disincarnate spirits that remain after. I believe I don't see any reason to doubt the OBE reports that I've read. There's such there are so many common factors in all these reports that I have a feeling that I certainly, okay, I'll tell you why I believe that we're not just a body beginning. Let's start with that maybe. I had two extremely intense out of body experiences 2 years ago. The first one, and these weren't the first ones I'd ever had, but these ones were interesting because they have corroborative kind of dimensions to it. Like they actually, they seem to be designed, or at least I seem to have experienced them in order to prove to myself that they had happened. They weren't just dreams. So the first one was, I was my daughter was with my wife in bed because, you know, she couldn't sleep, so she went up. So I went down on the couch and I was sleeping on the couch, and I popped out of my body. I woke up and I was kind of floating in the room, and I made my way up to the bedroom upstairs, and then I noticed that I saw my wife sleeping, and I saw this big gray ball on the bed. I was like, what is that? It was really strange. And everything's kind of like subaqueous and strange and submarine like. So you know how it is when you're in a kind of, you know, it's kind of like the upside down in Stranger Things a little bit, like everything's a little wobbly. So I'm looking at what is that on the bed? And eventually I got pulled back into my body, woke up. And the next morning, I mentioned this to my wife, and she said, well, Delphine had brought her big elephant, you know, or gone to get her big stuffed elephant and brought it to bed. So the big gray thing was this giant stuffed elephant on the bed. So I was like, well, that's weird. I didn't know she'd had that in bed. So that's what I saw in my dream, right? And then the second thing, the next one happened about a month later. And this one was very strange. I woke up, I was floating in the living room again, right in the stairwell. And I'm like, oh God, I'm having an out of body experience. So I start to kind of like, you know, float over into the living room. I wanted to go outside and kind of explore, but of course everything's weird. And there was this menacing presence around me, and I felt like I couldn't quite navigate, you know, it was like being underwater. So there's a current and I'm getting pulled, and finally like, I need to get back to bed. So I fly up the stairwell and I make my way to my room, to our room, my wife and I's room. And I see her lying there in bed, and I see myself sleeping. And so I managed to kind of swim, or like, you know, will my way to the bed. And I'm trying to climb over her into my body. And then I suddenly get kind of pulled out by this kind of undertow back into the hallway. Very frightening feeling. I see her kind of like, I see the room kind of like just moving away from me. And then I wake up with a start. And the next morning I go to breakfast, and my wife's like, I had the strangest dream. I said, what was your dream? She said, I dreamt that you were next. I was trying to wake you up because there was someone in the room. And I woke up, and there were like some hands, somebody was grabbing me, trying to climb on top of me or something. It was really frightening. And then I opened my eyes, and all of a sudden were these two gray hands just disappearing in the doorway, like just like being pulled away.
Wow.
Yeah, it was crazy. Yeah. So I'm like, this is, I couldn't believe it. So I shared my half of the story. And then from that day on, again, it's like the UFO thing. What am I supposed to do with that experience? I have to now say, I know we're not limited by our bodies, that we exist outside the body. I can't say, oh, I can't be humble about it. I can be humble strategically, but for myself, I have experienced these things. I'm sure it's the same for a lot of people in this group, is that a lot of us have experienced, we know things. We know that there's much more than we've been told there is. So all this to say that I believe that what happens after death, I believe that it's a multiplicity of things. There are many, many realms. What I take from my own tradition is the idea that there is a kind of absolute, an absolute background, I think, or an absolute kind of heaven, for lack of a better term, where one is very, very close to the Godhead. And I believe that there are many, many entities there, things we call angels, and that these beings are, in a sense, the thoughts or the emanations, I think, of this Godhead. So I believe that there's some truth to that. It doesn't exist just in Catholicism. It's in Neoplatonic thought. It's certainly in Islamic thought. And of course, Jews are very well acquainted with this type of thing. So I think there's, and to be honest, and even in Buddhism, you'll find similar things. So I just believe that's the case. But then between us and that thing, that place, that non-place, let's say, there are tiers and tiers of other realms, which in Catholicism are referred to collectively as purgatory. And but one of the really interesting theories I read recently is this is by a Catholic theologian, a Jesuit theologian named Karl Rahner. Is it Karl Rahner? Yeah, Rahner. His last name is Rahner. And he wrote a book called Foundations of Christian Faith and a bunch of really amazing books. He was a really deep thinker. And he was one of the first, I think, to start linking, since the early church fathers, because a lot of the early church fathers were open to the idea of metapsychosis, which is like reincarnation. But Rahner basically said, well, maybe the doctrine of purgatory is a way of expressing something like samsara, something like the wheel of rebirth, and that we are, in a sense, in purgatory, that we're constantly kind of living out lives and slowly kind of purging ourselves or cleansing ourselves as we prepare ourselves for some kind of epiphanic encounter with the Godhead. So I think that in a sense, we are already in a liminal, strange, esoteric dimension already. But I think that there's a multitude of such realms and a lot of places you could end up. I've actually had the very kind of unpleasant experience of ending up in a very, very bad realm of that sort one time. I've been talking long enough though, but I'll leave it at that.
No, I'd love to
Do you want to hear about it?
Oh, I want to hear about the terrible realm,
yeah.
please.
I do
Yeah,
too.
well, if you're up for it.
Yeah, it's kind of embarrassing, really. When I was a teenager, a couple of friends and I got into basically making ourselves pass out by blocking the blood flow to our heads. It's not something I recommend. It's not something I'm proud of. It's actually quite embarrassing to even talk about it. Didn't last long. The last time I did this thing, so it didn't involve asphyxiation, but it was more like blocking blood flow. Yeah, kids. And we would pass out and then we wake up with this tingly, amazing feeling. And I can't believe, anyways. So the last time I did this, I was out for a while and I awoke in what felt like the bottom of a pit. And I opened my eyes, so to speak, and suddenly I was surrounded by these creatures. And they looked, again, this is what I think it's so cliche once you pop on I think it's so cliche. These creatures were like goblins or demons. They were tugging at me and pulling me across this space. They were like fighting over each other. They were fighting each other over me. And I was like, where am I? And then suddenly I just popped up in my body again. And then for the longest time, I was like, oh my God, that was the worst place I could imagine. It was a horrible, horrible place. I remember thinking, you don't want to end up in this place. You don't want to be here. And I kept thinking, well, is this where I'll pop up when I die? But then I realized, well, I essentially kind of committed suicide that day in a very literal sense without meaning to. And to me, it came as a warning. I interpret it, that experience, as a kind of warning. Like, don't play fast and loose with this life and with this body. So, but that's what I experienced. So again, I keep telling myself, what do I do with this experience? Do I just decide that it never happened, that it was just a hallucination, that it was this, that it was that? I just don't know how useful it would be to take that tactic when all of these experiences fit perfectly well in ancient ways of seeing and traditions that are perfectly equipped to accommodate such experiences and even give them place. So I don't know what the point is in my adopting a skeptical attitude towards these things, even though they manifest as like cliche movie scenes. Sometimes they just look too much like you'd expect them to look, but sometimes that's the way it is. These things look like the way you'd expect them to, maybe because we've seen them before, maybe that's why they look like that in movies,
Absolutely. That makes perfect sense. They're There has to be a source somewhere, and archetypes are archetypes, right? Thank you so much for sharing that. I remember doing similar
Yeah.
that right, that with the school kids on the playground, and I'm glad that I didn't quite go that far and get to that realm at that point. That would have been a little bit too much at that age.
It was very scary.
Yeah. I remember doing that too. Let's all hyperventilate.
I'm happy to hear that you guys did this, because
Oh yeah.
thank God.
It's just
I'm
get
not
out
alone.
the shit, you know.
Yeah. We were morbid kids too, JF. Don't no worries.
Is
Absolutely.
it just our generation? I don't know if we're the same age, but it was a generational thing, maybe. I don't know. I hope the kids aren't doing that anymore. I don't want my daughters doing that.
I hope the kids are not doing that as well. If they learn a lesson like you did, then maybe it's all for good. Along those lines, Kristen, you've got a somewhat related question from one of our members here. Would you like to ask that?
Yes, the one from.
Yep.
Okay. I noticed that experiencers have many reincarnation experiences. It's also curious that our Western culture is very dismissive of the concept. Of course, soul development seems to be part of many occult systems. What do you think the tension between these reincarnation experiences and our cultural view is telling us about the development of the soul? Great question.
Wow. As a Westerner, reincarnation felt very counterintuitive to me as a child. When I actually I learned about Carl Jung reading a book on reincarnation. I was like 15 or something, or 14. I was in grade 9 and I suddenly became really fascinated with the idea of reincarnation, but it's just never felt real to me. Now that doesn't mean I don't think it's true. It's never felt like something that made sense. That's probably just cultural. I was raised in a religion that didn't include that particular idea. As I learned about philosophy and the history of philosophy, I started to learn that many ancients in the West believe in reincarnation. Plato hints at it in some dialogues. Certainly Pythagoras, who was in whose school Plato had studied, was a believer in metapsychosis and reincarnation. And I've also found that the evidence for it is quite compelling, just how the Tibetan lamas find the new incarnations of their teachers. I find that very strange, and also a lot of the people who've been actually trying to prove that reincarnation is real by basically taking people who have memories of other lives to the location and showing how they actually know the place and know the people. So I'm very much open to it. I don't think that there's actually any real conflict between Western ideas about the afterlife and Eastern ideas about the afterlife. I think that I think there's plenty of room in the West to accommodate or to integrate an idea of reincarnation. And that's exactly what Karl Rahner was trying to do. The theologian I mentioned earlier was to bring the doctrine of reincarnation into Catholicism by thinking through this idea of purgatory, which basically it's a place where you go to develop your soul further, to cleanse it or to develop or to prepare it for. So that's essentially the doctrine of the wheel of rebirth and samsara, is that as you go through your lives, you're actually every time you're kind of just looking for an opportunity to reach enlightenment or to progress at least to the next realm. And so I'm very open to it.
Some people come into a life with scars that appear to be from a former life, or they have some kind of mentality that, like for instance, I have scars on the insides of my arms, which are very bizarre. I didn't have a lot of medical, I didn't have a lot of blood drawn or anything like that, but I have a very distinct feeling that I was a drug addict in past. So this is one of those things that I never put the two together until recently. And it kind of took being in the experiencer group and sort of exploring these various concepts and ideas. Who knows if that would ever hold water. in Western culture, but there are people who have these anomalous scars that they were born with, and that's the best way they can explain it.
Yeah, another way of looking at it would be to look at it as lining up your past lives on a linear time frame. On the linear timeline just seems like a very kind of perspectival and limited way of thinking about it. Yeah, since the soul, if we have a soul, since it exists outside of time, or at least in some other ontology of time, couldn't it be that we could live many different lives at once? Or maybe that there are spiritual resonances between lives, such that your soul, Kirsten, your soul resonates with the soul of a drug addict in the 1960s or something, and there's a kind of resonance there, or a kind of I don't know. It's hard to talk about this stuff. All I know is I can't imagine that such a thing wouldn't happen. If there can be ghosts and spirits, then certainly ghosts and spirits can find a new body, perhaps, and come back. Maybe not everyone is a reincarnated soul. Maybe some of us are and some of us aren't.
JF, you're often pointing your listeners to exploring your inspirations. And I think I speak for many when I say that you and Phil have become deep sources of inspiration yourself. This has been a brilliant conversation. Thanks so much for taking the time with us tonight. It's deeply appreciated.
Well, thank you. Thank you for being so welcoming, and it was a real pleasure to talk to you all.
The Experiencer Group is a private gathering place for those who've had anomalous experiences, such as precognition, out of body, near-death, clairvoyance, ghosts, UFOs, past life, lucid dreams, and more. Within the site, members can join groups specific to their interests and access original content, including exclusive sessions where you interact directly with important luminaries and ask them your burning questions. Members also have confidential meetups with others from around the world and get access to in-person events, exclusive podcasts, and video series. No trolls, no stigmas, just intelligent, deep people like you who've had extraordinary experiences. Go to theexperiencergroup.com to become a member.